What if I told you the digital future isn't set in stone? That unlike Calhoun's mice, we have something they didn't: awareness of the experiment we're in. Throughout this series, we've explored the unsettling parallels between social media platforms and Calhoun's Universe 25 experiment. The withdrawal, the fragmented reality, the erosion of empathy. But humans aren't mice in a controlled experiment. Former tech executive Tristan Harris, who once led design ethics at Google, told about his dramatic digital habit changes: cutting platform use by 70%, implementing strict time boundaries, and disabling notifications. The improvement in my mental clarity and relationship quality was so immediate and profound that it felt like waking from a strange dream, he said. His experience isn't unique. As awareness grows about these platforms' impacts, more people are consciously altering their digital habits and reporting significant well-being improvements. The first step in escaping a trap is recognizing you're in one. Throughout our previous episodes, we've examined how digital platforms evolved into unintended behavioral experiments, explored the algorithmic mechanisms driving these environments, and investigated the emerging social consequences, what we might call a digital behavioral sink. Today, we consider possible futures for our relationship with these technologies. Not to advocate specific solutions or political positions, but to explore different trajectories our digital landscape might follow, and what each path could mean for individual well-being and social cohesion. The choices we make in the coming years, both individually and collectively, will shape whether these technologies ultimately strengthen or undermine the foundations of healthy human connection. Our first potential trajectory is what we might call the accelerated sync scenario. Essentially, the continuation and intensification of current trends. In this future, engagement-optimized algorithms continue prioritizing emotional intensity over well-being, fragmenting information landscapes further, while increasing polarization and social withdrawal. Projections based on current trend lines suggest potential increases in loneliness and anxiety disorders of 47% and 36%, respectively, over the next decade, if platform mechanics remain unchanged. Most concerning in this scenario is the potential for growing tribalism and declining trust in shared institutions. The social infrastructure necessary for addressing complex collective challenges like climate change, pandemics, or economic transitions that require coordinated responses. The accelerated sync would likely manifest differently across demographic groups. Research suggests adolescents and young adults, whose developmental windows coincide with intense platform exposure, would experience the most significant impacts on social skill development and identity formation. One longitudinal study tracking digital natives over 7 years found progressive increases in social anxiety and decreases in empathic accuracy, the ability to correctly identify others' emotional states, suggesting these environments may fundamentally reshape social cognition for generations raised within them. If we continue on this path, we may find ourselves with billions of digital connections, but increasingly unable to maintain meaningful relationships. All the while wondering why we feel so desperately alone, despite unprecedented connectivity. Perhaps most concerning in this scenario is the potential for what psychology researchers term learned helplessness regarding technology, an acquired belief that we cannot meaningfully influence our relationship with these platforms. As users become increasingly aware of manipulation, but see few alternatives, many adopt a fatalistic attitude, believing these systems are too entrenched or powerful to change. This learned helplessness creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where decreased agency perception leads to decreased agency attempts, further entrenching problematic platform dynamics. One researcher described this as digital resignation, the condition where users recognize they're being manipulated but feel powerless to resist, implicitly accepting surveillance and behavior modification as the cost of digital participation. In the accelerated sync scenario, vulnerable populations would likely experience disproportionate impacts. Children and adolescents, whose neurological development occurs within these environments, show particularly concerning outcomes in early research. Studies tracking children with high platform exposure from ages 8–16 found significant correlations between usage patterns and structural brain development differences, particularly in areas associated with attention regulation, impulse control, and social cognition. These developmental impacts create what neuropsychologists call cognitive vulnerability windows, periods where developing brains are particularly susceptible to environmental influences. Unlike adults, who experience these platforms with already developed cognitive frameworks, children developing within algorithmic environments may have fundamentally different baseline cognitive patterns. Mental health vulnerability appears especially pronounced in this scenario. Individuals with pre-existing anxiety, depression, or attention regulation challenges consistently show amplified negative outcomes from platform exposure. One 5-year tracking study found that adolescents with anxiety disorders experienced a 340% greater increase in symptom severity with heavy platform use compared to non-anxious peers. This suggests algorithmic environments may function as vulnerability amplifiers, spaces that disproportionately harm those already predisposed to certain conditions. The cruel irony is that those seeking connection or distraction from psychological distress often turn to these platforms, potentially exacerbating the very conditions they're attempting to escape. Socioeconomic factors also predict vulnerability in this scenario. Research consistently shows that individuals with fewer offline social resources, whether due to economic constraints, geographic isolation, or limited community infrastructure, display greater susceptibility to problematic platform use and associated harms. Without robust, real-world social alternatives, these users become increasingly dependent on digital connections despite their limitations. The pattern creates what sociologists term digital dependency cycles, where increased platform use substitutes for declining offline connection, further eroding real-world social skills and opportunities, creating greater dependency in a self-reinforcing cycle. This dynamic threatens to widen existing social divides rather than bridge them, despite platforms' stated democratizing intentions. Beyond individual impacts, the accelerated sync scenario has profound implications for social cohesion and democratic functioning. Research from Princeton University suggests that continued algorithmic amplification of outrage and tribal identity could further erode what political scientists call democratic forbearance, the willingness to respect institutional boundaries and accept legitimate political opposition. As users increasingly occupy divergent information ecosystems, basic consensus on factual reality becomes more difficult, undermining the shared epistemic foundation necessary for democratic deliberation. One researcher described this as reality fragmentation, a condition where citizens no longer simply disagree about interpretations, but inhabit fundamentally different perceived realities, making productive disagreement nearly impossible. This social fragmentation extends beyond politics to cultural cohesion more broadly. Algorithms optimizing for engagement effectively split users into increasingly distinct cultural worlds, with fewer shared references, experiences, or narratives. Media consumption that once created common cultural touchpoints now fragments into highly personalized content streams. Research from Oxford University suggests this fragmentation threatens what sociologists call social capital, the networks of relationships that enable society to function effectively. As shared experiences decline, so does the baseline trust and cooperation necessary for addressing collective challenges. One cultural anthropologist characterized this as cultural atomization, the gradual dissolution of connective tissue that makes coordinated social action possible. Perhaps most concerning is the potential impact on collective problem-solving capacity. Complex challenges like climate change, pandemic response, or economic transitions require coordinated action based on shared understanding and trust. Yet platform dynamics often optimize for precisely the opposite: fragmentation, distrust, and emotional reactivity. Research from MIT's Collective Intelligence Lab suggests that groups exposed to polarizing algorithmic content before problem-solving tasks showed a 42% reduction in collaborative effectiveness compared to control groups. The mechanics driving this reduction include decreased willingness to consider out-group perspectives, reduced trust in shared information sources, and increased emotional reactivity when faced with contradictory viewpoints. All traits directly reinforced by engagement-optimized platforms. Our second potential trajectory is what we might call the algorithmic reformation scenario, where platforms evolve toward optimization metrics beyond mere engagement. This scenario doesn't require abandoning technology, but rather redirecting it toward different outcomes through modified incentive structures. Early research on prosocial algorithms shows promising results. One study involving 28,000 users found that algorithmic adjustments prioritizing constructive exchanges over conflict reduced polarization measures by 35% within just 14 weeks, without reducing overall platform usage. Another experiment demonstrated that prioritizing content rated as informative, rather than merely engaging, decreased misinformation spread by 61% while maintaining user satisfaction. These findings suggest that many negative outcomes aren't inherent to digital platforms themselves, but rather to specific optimization targets. The business case for reformation is emerging as well. As platform saturation increases and growth slows, retention becomes economically vital. Research from Harvard Business School suggests that engagement-maximizing strategies often create short-term gains, but long-term sustainability problems as users experience what researchers term platform fatigue. Declining satisfaction and eventual abandonment due to perceived manipulation or negative experiences. Several mid-sized platforms experimenting with well-being-oriented metrics report 23% higher retention, rates over 18 months compared to engagement-optimized competitors. The challenge is convincing companies that healthy users are more valuable than addicted ones. It's like asking cigarette companies to design less addictive cigarettes, possible, but against their current financial incentives. This reformation scenario would likely require both internal and external pressure. Internally, growing evidence suggests platform employees increasingly question optimization strategies focused solely on engagement. One survey of 800 tech workers found that 72% expressed ethical concerns about their product's psychological impacts, with 43% reporting they had raised these concerns internally. Externally, user awareness creates market pressure through increased platforms switching when alternatives emerge. However, significant barriers remain, including what economists call multi-sided market effects. The tendency of platforms to become more valuable as more users join, creating powerful incumbency advantages. For reformation to succeed, these network effects would need to be overcome through sufficient consumer demand for healthier alternatives or regulatory frameworks that reduce switching costs. Might algorithmic reformation look like in practice? Research highlights several promising approaches already being tested at smaller scales. Friction design, intentionally slowing certain platform mechanics to enable more deliberate user choices, has shown particularly strong results. One experiment found that introducing a 7-second delay before sharing emotionally provocative content decreased misinformation spread by 73% without reducing overall platform engagement. Similarly, circuit breaker algorithms that temporarily limit content acceleration during viral spread events have reduced coordinated manipulation campaigns by 67% in controlled tests. These approaches don't restrict speech or ban content. They simply modify the velocity dynamics that often amplify problematic material before human moderation or fact-checking systems can respond. Another promising reformation path involves transparent algorithm control, providing users greater visibility into and control over the factors shaping their experience. Research from Stanford's Human-Centered AI Lab found that platforms offering even basic algorithm adjustability saw significant increases in user satisfaction and trust, with 79% of users actively modifying their settings when given clear, simple options. More sophisticated approaches include what researchers call algorithmic nutritional labels, standardized disclosures about how recommendation systems function and what factors they prioritize. These transparency mechanisms address what ethicists term informational asymmetry, the significant power imbalance created when platforms possess detailed behavioral data and prediction models, while users remain unaware of how their information environment is being shaped. Perhaps the most fundamental reformation approach involves shifting basic optimization targets from engagement to well-being-oriented metrics. Early experiments with time well-spent metrics, which prioritize user satisfaction with time spent rather than simply maximizing duration, show promising results for both users and businesses. One study comparing engagement-optimized versus satisfaction-optimized news feeds found the latter produced 34% higher user-reported meaningfulness ratings and 17% greater long-term retention, despite 12% less total time spent on the platform. The challenge involves measurement. Engagement metrics like clicks and watch time are easily quantified, while well-being impacts require more sophisticated assessment. Some platforms have begun experimenting with regular user reflection prompts, asking not just whether content was engaging, but whether users found it valuable, informative, or meaningful, creating richer feedback signals for algorithmic training. Our third potential trajectory combines external regulation with increased user empowerment, what we might call the regulation and empowerment scenario. Unlike the algorithmic reformation approach, which relies primarily on platform self-correction, this scenario involves establishing societal guardrails while simultaneously building user capacity to navigate digital environments more consciously. The European Digital Services Act represents the most comprehensive regulatory framework to date, requiring unprecedented algorithmic transparency, risk assessments for potential societal harms, and independent researcher access to platform data. Initial implementation data suggests these requirements have already driven significant internal platform governance changes, with companies developing more robust harm mitigation systems to avoid potential liability. The key insight from early regulatory efforts is that visibility itself creates accountability. Simply knowing practices will be examined changes organizational behavior. Complementing regulation, digital literacy initiatives show promise in building user resilience. A 2-year study involving 12,000 high school students found that curriculum explaining platform mechanics and attention-capturing techniques reduced problematic usage patterns by 26%, while increasing critical information evaluation skills by 31%. Unlike traditional media literacy focused primarily on content evaluation, effective digital literacy addresses what researchers call manipulative design awareness, understanding how platform architecture itself shapes behavior and perception. One educator described this as seeing the water you're swimming in, developing the capacity to recognize environmental influences that otherwise remain invisible. Research suggests this awareness creates a form of psychological immunity, with knowledge of persuasive mechanics significantly reducing susceptibility to manipulation. User empowerment also involves alternative platform models that align economic incentives with user well-being. Member-owned platforms, subscription models, and public interest digital spaces represent different approaches to addressing what economists call misaligned incentives, situations where platform financial interests directly counter user well-being. Early experiments with user-governed platforms show promising results, with one study finding that communities with direct governance input reported 47% higher trust ratings and 28% less problematic content compared to algorithmically managed spaces. Perhaps the most revolutionary act in the digital age isn't logging off entirely. It's demanding to know what's in the algorithm sausage and having a say in how it's made. Alternative governance models represent practical examples of how digital spaces might function when not driven exclusively by engagement maximization. While systemic changes matter, individual choices remain powerful in shaping digital experiences. Research increasingly identifies specific practices associated with healthier platform engagement. Time boxing, setting predetermined usage windows rather than allowing unlimited scrolling, correlates strongly with reduced anxiety and improved attention. One study found users who implemented 25-minute bounded sessions reported 39% less anxiety and 42% greater satisfaction than continuous users, despite identical total usage time. Similarly, notification management, limiting which applications can interrupt attention, shows substantial impacts. Users who disabled non-essential notifications experienced 37% fewer daily interruptions, resulting in 18% longer, sustained attention periods and significantly reduced stress markers. These findings suggest that how we engage with platforms matters as much as whether we engage. Content curation strategies also demonstrate meaningful impacts. Research shows that actively pruning one's digital connections, regularly removing sources that consistently produce negative emotional states, significantly improves experience quality. One longitudinal study found users who quarterly reviewed and adjusted their information sources reported 41% higher information value ratings and 33% lower frustration levels compared to passive consumers. Similarly, intentional cognitive framing, consciously recognizing algorithms as imperfect curation systems rather than objective reality presenters, creates what psychologists call algorithmic distancing, reducing the emotional impact of provocative content. Users trained in this perspective showed 27% lower emotional reactivity to algorithm-selected content while maintaining critical engagement with the material. Perhaps most promising are deliberate counter-practices that specifically address platform-induced cognitive patterns. Attention restoration activities, particularly nature exposure, meditation, and deep reading, appear to counteract what neuroscientists call attentional fragmentation resulting from platform use. One study found that 30 minutes of nature exposure immediately following platform use restored attention depletion measures to baseline levels, while control groups showed continued deficits for 3+ hours. Similarly, deep work practices, extended, uninterrupted focus on challenging tasks, appear to strengthen neural pathways weakened by constant task switching. Users who implemented daily 90-minute deep work sessions showed progressive improvements in focus capacity, with cognitive control measurements increasing 29% over 3 months, directly countering platform-induced attention patterns. Any discussion of digital futures must consider generational differences in platform relationships. Those who experienced pre-digital adulthood, who remember life before smartphones and social media, generally approach these technologies as tools added to an established identity and social framework. By contrast, digital natives, who developed within these environments, may experience them as fundamental social reality rather than optional tools. Research from developmental psychology suggests these differences create what researchers term baseline normality perceptions, fundamentally different expectations about normal social interaction, attention patterns, and information processing. One study found that Gen Z participants considered checking social media within 5 minutes of waking normal and expected, while older participants viewed the same behavior as potentially problematic, reflecting these divergent baseline perceptions. These generational differences extend to cognitive adaptation. While concerning effects appear across age groups, younger users show greater neuroplastic adaptation to digital environments, effectively developing cognitive patterns optimized for platform navigation. Research from Columbia University found that adolescents displayed 47% greater multitasking efficiency between digital tasks compared to older adults, but 26% greater attention penalties when switching to sustained focus activities. This suggests what neuroscientists call environment-specific optimization, the brain adapting efficiently to prevalent conditions, but potentially at the cost of capabilities required in different contexts. The question isn't whether these adaptations are good or bad, but rather what they optimize for and what they might sacrifice, and whether those trade-offs serve long-term individual and collective flourishing. Taking an evolutionary perspective helps contextualize our current moment. Human cognitive architecture evolved over millennia for particular information processing demands, generally involving limited inputs, natural attention cycles, and information tightly coupled to survival needs. Digital platforms represent an evolutionary mismatch, environments our brains didn't calve to navigate. As one evolutionary psychologist noted, we're running Paleolithic hardware on digital software, and the compatibility issues are becoming increasingly apparent. However, humans possess unique capacity for what anthropologists call cultural adaptation, the ability to create environmental modifications and behavioral practices that bridge gaps between biological evolution and environmental demands. Throughout history, new technologies have created similar mismatches, with societies gradually developing norms, practices, and structures to integrate innovations beneficially, from writing systems to printing presses to broadcast media. Unlike Calhoun's deterministic mouse experiment, our digital future remains unwritten. The key difference is human metacognition, our ability to recognize patterns, understand influences, and deliberately reshape our relationship with technology. The digital behavioral sync we've explored throughout this series isn't inevitable, but rather one possible trajectory among many. The patterns we've identified, from social withdrawal to reality fragmentation to empathy erosion, stem not from technology itself, but from specific design choices, economic incentives, and optimization targets that could be redirected. Recognition of these patterns is itself the foundation for potential intervention, whether through platform reformation, regulatory approaches, or individual practice changes that modify how we engage with digital environments. Throughout this exploration, we've highlighted concerning parallels between our current digital trajectory and Calhoun's behavioral sync. However, critical differences remain. Unlike Calhoun's mice, confined to unchangeable conditions, we possess agency to modify our environments and practices. Unlike mice, we can identify problematic patterns and create counterbalances before reaching irreversible thresholds. And perhaps most importantly, unlike mice, we can engage in collective action to reshape technological systems themselves, aligning them more closely with human well-being and flourishing. The question isn't whether these technologies influence our behavior and society. They unquestionably do, but rather how deliberate and conscious we choose to be about these influences and their long-term implications. The most promising path forward combines multiple approaches: platform accountability through transparency and modified incentives, user empowerment through literacy and tool development, research independence to evaluate outcomes, and ethical frameworks that prioritize human flourishing over narrow optimization metrics. The challenge isn't technological but human, involving values, priorities, and social structures that determine how technologies evolve. As we navigate this digital landscape, the most important insight may be that these platforms aren't simply tools we use, but environments that shape us. Recognizing this environmental influence doesn't diminish human agency, but rather enables its more effective exercise, allowing us to engage with these powerful technologies not as passive subjects in an unintended experiment, but as conscious participants deliberately shaping technological evolution toward more beneficial ends. As we conclude this exploration of digital platforms as unintended social experiments, I hope we've provided a framework for understanding these environments and their influence on individual behavior and social dynamics. Throughout this series, we've examined how platforms function as behavioral laboratories, explored the algorithmic mechanisms shaping these environments, investigated emerging social consequences, and considered potential futures for our relationship with these technologies. Rather than providing definitive answers or advocating specific solutions, we've aimed to raise awareness about patterns that often remain invisible, yet profoundly influence modern life. The question isn't whether to embrace or reject technology, but rather how to design digital environments that strengthen rather than undermine the foundations of healthy individual and collective functioning. Unlike Calhoun's mice, we can recognize the patterns and reshape our environment. The question is whether we will choose to do so. Thank you for joining this exploration. May it contribute to more conscious, deliberate engagement with the digital landscapes that increasingly shape our shared reality.